Clack. No! Slit. The cliffhanger, a powerful hook designed to have you coming back for more. But what about when that more never comes? Well, then you get moments like the murder of Silver St. Cloud, or seeming murder. Moments that are destined to haunt the reader, maybe forever. There has long been talk that these Batman DC series by Kevin Smith would be finished. And who knows, maybe one day they will be, time of recording. But as it stands, it's been 13 years and counting. This since the Batman Cacophony sequel, The Widening Gyre. Why does this haunt me? Not really because I need to know what happens. Now I'm more curious about the details, and just saddened by the fact that time of recording, this was the last serious comic usage of Silver St. Cloud. And it's quite the brutal end. Now this happened in 2010, so just very shortly before the line-wide reboot that would be the New 52 in 2011. And this last image, it's pretty visceral. It definitely conjures up, oh, she's dead. But how did this happen? How did we get to this seemingly perpetual cliffhanger? What was the next half of the story supposed to be? And is there still a chance that we'll see it? I'm Sasha, this is Casually Comics, and join me on this whim. We're gonna see how a run goes from being a hot commodity to maligned, and also try not to blind you with it with the lighting that I've got going on. We'll also see how a creator being pulled in too many directions can leave work dangling, lost in the void, like Tanya Spears, and maybe also like Tanya, she'll randomly reappear with no explanation, then vanish once more. I'm not over it. Now to see how the series fell off, we must first go back to how it happened in the first place. And at the center of that is the series writer Kevin Smith. Kevin Smith has a long history in nerd culture and has long proclaimed himself a fanboy. He also has many credits as a creator in films, television, and comics. He also has long been a very vocal and outspoken nerd, a status that has changed over time as to how it's been received. Also, in some circles, he's become a crying meme, and he's been at the center of some fandom controversies. But in the late 90s and early 2000s, he was a hot commodity, especially in nerd circles. There was a kind of one of us vibe. His name came with some level of credibility that you were getting something also created by a fan for fans. Smith had long loudly proclaimed his comic fandom and had written comics based off his own work, such as Clerks and Jay and Silent Bob, published through Oni Press. By the late 90s and early aughts, he was approached to write for both Marvel and DC. He had runs on Daredevil and Green Arrow. On Green Arrow, he would bring Oliver Queen back to life and introduce a couple of characters, like Mia, and also Onomatopoeia, the villain who makes his own sound effects, and has managed to keep coming around again and again. They recently got a power upgrade on Superman and Lois, which means there were interviews out there by Kevin Smith about how cool it was to see the character on TV, even though there are earlier interviews about how he didn't feel the character could work on TV. But that's not what this video is about. Smith's early comic runs were decently received and would lead to more work, but in the early 2000s, the writing was already on the wall. That writing being that Smith had a hard time balancing his projects, and that he tended to take on a lot, probably too much, and that when push came to shove between these various projects, the comic ones would take a back seat. Spider-Man / Black Cat, The Evil Men Do was a 6-issue miniseries that began in 2002, but it found its last 3 issues, the release of them delayed by 3 years. This because Smith was working on Jersey Girl and Clerks 2. Daredevil / Bullseye the Target also debuted in 2002, and its last issue never came out. We'll just never know. Now, despite this, Smith's name remained a draw, and in 2008, he was commissioned to do a Batman series. This would be the miniseries Batman Cacophony. I feel like I'm pronouncing that in a way that's gonna bother some people, like most things I say. Now, in all fairness to this mini, it went well on the production side. It was released from November 2008 through the January of 2009, so on time. And it went on to become a bestseller, a New York Times bestseller. The sequel will tell you that on the cover. It's like, ooh, sequel to the New York Times bestseller. This is why I can't hold things. I'm just brandishing them at you. So what was Cacophony about? Well, in brief, the plot of Cacophony was very villain focused and brought back Smith's own character of Onomatopoeia, who was instrumental in saving the Joker from being murdered by Deadshot and setting the Joker loose on Gotham to get Batman's attention. This is who Onomatopoeia is really after, because his MO now is that he's out to get all non-superpowered vigilantes. The Joker was meanwhile after Maxie Zeus because he turned his Joker venom into a street drug. It wasn't okay then. When Punchline does it now, it's fine apparently. But he ultimately got stabbed by Onomatopoeia, so we got to one of those should Batman kill the Joker / let him die endings. Batman let him live, and then him and the Joker had a heartfelt conversation in the hospital while the Joker was on lots of drugs and had a huge beard. Well, with a New York Times bestseller label and a decent critical reception at the time, even though at the time people were already highlighting issues that would become much more foregrounded in the sequel, this inside of it and in critiques of it, regardless of all that, it was time for The Widening Gyre. A title that is very dramatically referencing a Yeats poem. It's the second coming, and it's from the first line actually. Turning and turning in the widening gyre. The poem uses the concept of the apocalypse as an allegory. This for the state of the world post-World War I, and also for the effects that the great influenza, more colloquially known as the Spanish flu, was having on society. So with that kind of referencing, you expect Widening Jar to be very intense and deep, because Cacophony did kind of match its title. This in terms of how chaotic it was and all the things happening in it. This one, not so much. Now, like the first book, this was a joint project between Kevin Smith and his friend Walt Flanagan, who Smith admitted he used his pull to get on the project, stating in the trade introduction of Cacophony, "Walt got the job because he's my friend, and yes, it's unseemly and unprofessional to trade in such naked nepotism, so much so that a base coach from the other team insinuated that I bullied DC editorial into giving my guy the job. I mean, sure, that's one way to look at it, or you can view it through this prism. Without Walt, not only would Cacophony not exist, I'd have likely never read any comics beyond Sad Sack or Hot Stuff the Little Devil. Walt Flanagan was my comics guru." The second team-up was meant to be a 12-issue maxi series. This because Smith was excited by the idea that the series could be split into 2 books of 6 issues. It's hard to cast back to a time when trades weren't commonplace, but the 90s really saw the rise of the popularity of the trade paperback and things being collected in that form. And it also shifted from being just special or premiere runs and limited series to just everything. There was a time when something coming out in a trade of 6 issues was not a guarantee. Now it's expected, to the point where some people actually write for the trade, and on the reader and fan side, some people can just trade wait just until the run is done. It's slowly changed the landscape a bit. In this early trade heyday, they were printing pretty much anything. Everything that could be compiled was being compiled. It was becoming a trade, an omni, a collection. I will admit though, it also irreparably shaped how I collect and view comics. Ludicrous sized books that I can't even pick up or hold comfortably to read? Yes, please. Now, Smith and Flanagan claimed they always planned to have a break in between issues 6 and 7, but they were also working on the reality show Comic Book Men, and that came to take priority, and the gap got longer and longer, to the point where the final 6 issues, what it was meant to be, shifted, and it changed from being a continuation to becoming its own 3rd book. This under the header Batman Bellicosity. In 2013, Smith gave an interview where he detailed some plans for Bellicosity, loosely. He also gave some thoughts on writing Batman in general, which are fascinating when you look back at these works. It helps put them in context. I have quotes, many quotes. Smith is nothing if not verbose about his thoughts on nerd culture, so I'm gonna read a bunch. Strap in. He stated, "Writing Batman, I loved the character so much. I always said, I don't want to write a Batman book. I'll just use him and stuff. Like I wrote Green Arrow for a while over at DC, and I wrote Batman into that story. And I felt like I could do it because he's not the linchpin. He's the supporting character, and I got the best of both worlds, writing him without having to write a Batman-centric story. But then, when The Dark Knight came out with all those billboards up in town, I was looking up at all these billboards in town, and I was like, you know what, man? Maybe I'm being a chicken. Maybe I should give it a shot, just write a Batman storyline." It's hard not to read that and just think Batman's popular now. I would like to write Batman. At least that's how I read it. Back to the quotes. And my friend Walter always talked about wanting to draw Batman. Not professionally, it was a dream, like a way far off dream, like something that he didn't even think he would accomplish. He would draw him for himself, but he never imagined he would get to draw for DC Comics. So I called up Dan Didio, who I met like once or twice before, and I said, "Hey man, I worked on Green Arrow there a couple years ago, and I feel like doing a Batman miniseries. Can I do a Batman miniseries there with my friend Walter?" He then goes on to discuss fan demand for a sequel to The Widening Gyre. I get a lot of people on Twitter every day without fail. Minimum 20 tweets. 20 whole tweets, oh my god. Twitter has this very interesting effect of seemingly amplifying a sentiment. You'll see entire articles where there's 2 tweets and it makes it seem as if it's a huge deluge of people. Twitter makes it a bit hard to gauge how much interest there is in certain topics at times. Back to the Twitter people, all 20 of them, clamoring for the sequel. So there is a 3rd Batman miniseries, which me and Walt are in the midst of. It's called Batman Bellicosity. It has 4 issues so far and 2 issues left to go. It kind of got put to the back burner because DC blew up their universe and started with the New 52, and I started working on Comic Book Men, and both things kind of happened at the same time. And all of a sudden, Batman Bellicosity kept getting pushed back and pushed back. But the good news is that it is giving a bunch of people time to catch up with the Cacophony and Widening Gyre, which have built up a nice fan base. I was talking to Dan, I was like, it doesn't really matter what we do since you guys are kind of done with this universe, and we can't really screw with continuity since you're rebooting all the continuity. So that kind of repurposed the ending a little bit. And me and Walt, we were like, now we can do the last Batman story. We can just go ape shit. And that is saying something, given some of the things that are happening in the Widening Gyre. Also, can you imagine if this was the last Batman story, like the ending to this? Would that be the darkest timeline? I know he means of that canon, but imagine. Now, the interviewer then asks him when it's coming out, and he says, "I keep saying at the end of this year, but I know the end of this year is gonna creep up on me really fast. But the good news is that everything takes care of itself." There's been this kind of ongoing discussion about working it into the next season of Comic Book Men, working it into one of the episodes and getting back to work on the Batman book. That way we can bring in people like Jim Lee and Dan Didio and find a way to get into DC Comics. This season, we feel we can tie it into Batman Bellicosity and give all the DC folks more of a reason to be like, yeah, let's do it. Let's be on the show. Now, based on these quotes, in my opinion, so take it all with a grain of salt. If you feel differently, let me know down below. But in my opinion, you can feel interest in the project and finishing it fading. And also just a bit of a lack of direction. That last quote really makes it feel like the comic is more a vehicle to boost the reality show. Just in general, when it comes to creative projects, it can be difficult to maintain passion for them as a creative person if other projects creep up and start to take precedence. Or if one is a person who is easily distracted or has a hard time focusing on just one thing. Things can get pushed to the back burner that way, and then they come up and there's a brief flare of enthusiasm and then they fall back. It really depends upon what type of person one is. Also, creators have a different relationship to their creations than a fan. There are cases when fans can form stronger bonds with works than their creators do. Everything on a case-by-case basis. This series just sounds like one of those things where there was a lot of passion for it and then it just kind of fell off, and every now and again there's a, oh yeah, I should finish that. Now, The Widening Gyre was a very different book than Cacophony, even if the writing style and art were the same. But two significant things had changed by the time they started coming out in 2009, 2010. One, this was a much more Batman-centric story than the prior work. And the times and what tone people expected out of Batman, who in the main verse was getting ever darker, while Smith's take was more juvenile and far from the man with plans upon plans upon plans. Just the way that manifested was not the same as you would see it in the main verse. For example, in The Widening Gyre, to get some DNA, Batman just rips some hair out of Silver St. Cloud's head. What the hell's going on? Stop it! Ow! Shut up! There's nothing subtle about it. He doesn't secretly gather, no, just yoink. There are lots of moments like that, so for some, the characterization in these just feel off when it comes to Batman. But what is going on in this? Well, like Cacophony, let's do it Cliff Note style. In The Widening Gyre, Batman finds himself being aided in his crime-fighting crusade by a mysterious new vigilante named Baphomet, which should have been a red flag right there, but it isn't. In his personal life, following the death of her husband, Silver St. Cloud is looking to rekindle her relationship with Bruce. But this causes him to have a hard time balancing being Batman, and he starts to make mistakes, even nearly losing to people like Cornelius Stirk. This leads to him relying more and more on Baphomet, who is proving to be more and more of an asset. He does this despite not being fully comfortable around him, or the fact that Baphomet just reveals his identity very early off and casually. But still, he lets him more and more into his life. There are other plots. It's mostly villain fights, so who he's fighting as he comes to rely more and more on Baphomet. And you have things like Aquaman discovering Batman and St. Cloud's secret romantic rendezvous place, which forces them to hang out more in Gotham. You have Catwoman being jealous of Silver, especially after Bruce proposes to her, but again, he has to rip some hair out of her head to check if Silver is a robot or not. But all of these things are building up to the big reveal, the moment at the end of issue 6. This occurs after Batman and Baphomet take down Calendar Man. Batman decides it's time to reveal his secret identity, and at that point, bam, Baphomet reveals that he was Onomatopoeia the whole time. Bye, Silver. Clack. No. Slit. Reception for this series was more mixed than for the first. There's a reason it says sequel to the New York Times bestseller and not also New York Times bestseller on it. You can also see the reactions shift more clearly at this period, because in 2010 how you could receive the information had changed. Various social media and online forums had crept up and become far more accessible, and superhero fare was starting to creep more and more into the mainstream. All of these factors changed the ways in which comics were discussed online, and there were some moments in this series, one in particular, that made the rounds. And it still does, and it's not Silver St. Cloud getting her throat slit. It's Batman peeing himself or having a bladder spasm. You can still find these articles from 2010, they're up there. I had a bladder spasm. No, you're saying you wet your pants? My point is, nobody starts off as an expert. This you learn through trial and error. Appreciate the tip. I know I'm still wet behind the ears. Very funny. Don't mean to piss you off. Yeah, come on. The reason for this is because a bomb went off, and that's supposed to be what caused the bladder spasm. This is one of those things that people still bring up. You can find articles as recent as 2020 that still talk about this. You can very much track the discussions surrounding this series online. So you'll see the beginning of this idea that there are some things that just follow you around online. One interesting thing to look back on is positive and negative reviews from 2010 when the book came out. Comics Alliance went hard back in the day. It calls Kevin Smith's Batman comics the worst comics they've ever read. The review does not hold back, and I just need to read some of it so you can see how some of the negative reviews were coming at this series at the time. Let's face it, Kevin Smith is a comics fan. That's one of the things he built his reputation on through his movies. He was the filmmaker who wore his geek influences on his sleeve, and whether or not it's another symptom of parts of the comic industry being so insecure that they beg for the table scraps of other media, the fact that he's a high-profile fan is a key aspect to these books. He's a fan, and if you're a fan and DC Comics comes to you and says, hey, write us a comic, you can do whatever you want, of course he's gonna do it. That's what every fan dreams of. It even goes a long way to forgiving the not very good art by longtime Smith friend Walter Flanagan, because after all, getting your friend a job drawing Batman, that's just being a good pal. This is in stark contrast to one of the good reviews, which I'll read after just for balance. Perfectly balanced as all things should be. But one of the things this review highlights is that even though the time, not just Smith himself, but the writing and the references inside these stories were being critiqued. They were being held up as juvenile, embarrassing, not as deep as the creators felt they were. For example, one moment highlighted is that this reviewer found off-putting that Silver calls Batman Dee Dee. It's a reference to the first night we got together. We hit double digits. Classy. Can you imagine if your significant other's nickname for you was based off of how many they gave you the first night that you were together? As promised, here's that good review for balance. All in all, Widening Gyre is a Batman tale that is very much a lot of madcap Kevin Smith fun, but toned down just enough that it's just the right amount of madcap fun. Both Smith and Flanagan do what they need to and make this a nice place to catch Bruce Wayne in action in light of the Batman Reborn line of books. If you're wondering, there were actually interviewers who asked Smith directly about the whole "did Batman pee himself" debacle. In 2010, he was on a podcast that was paraphrased by Comic Book Daily, and the rationale was explained as follows. Basically, for those of you who don't want to download the podcast, Kevin Smith asserts that Batman at this point in year one is still a bit inexperienced, and that by underestimating the strength of the explosion, the intense heat of the explosives made him have a small bladder spasm. Smith also states that he never explicitly said that Batman peed his pants, it was more like a few drips. He also adds that this heat causing pee is from personal experience, from when needing to pee whenever he sits on Backdraft the ride, and the intense heat makes him need to pee. So yeah, this is probably one of the funniest comic related news items of the month. Batman has got to have some of the most embarrassing news cycles that follow him around. This is up there with "does Batman go down?" These things have a way of lingering in online discourse in a way that they don't in other arenas. This moment even came up in 2013 when he was discussing Bellicosity. He stated, "When that came out, there were some comic book websites that really went after Walt's art, and during Widening Gyre, I got attacked because of he said Batman peed himself. Oh my god, it was nuts, dude. They were like, how dare you? You took one of the coolest moments and destroyed it by making him pee himself." And I'm like, that's not what it is. And all of what I wrote is scientifically rooted in fact. My fireman friend told me this, but whatever. This is because he used an actual moment from Batman Year One, which is a highly regarded Batman story. But he then claims it died down, which it clearly did not. There's always somebody who remembers on the internet, especially if there's a clickbaity title to be had. And also just some things stick with you. And so in an online discussion, sometimes they're fun to bring up. As for there still being people waiting for the series to finish, that sentiment seems to have dwindled. There are some people here or there, but it's definitely not a huge clamor. No, release the Snyder Cut for Batman Bellicosity. Now, the last mentions of Bellicosity I could find were from 2019 and 2020. In 2019, there was a tweet of him jokingly asking Jim Lee to do the covers for it. I know it was selfish to include Onomatopoeia in the Rogues Gallery of our hashtag Detective Comics 1000 story, but I couldn't pass up the chance to have @Jim Lee draw my character. Jim, can I convince you to do the covers for Batman Bellicosity, which Walt and I are ready to get back to? In 2020, when talking to Newsarama, he said this red folder goes with me everywhere. It's got 3 issues of art with notes for me and Walter to go back into and finish. I've been carrying this folder for 2 years. It's not Walter's fault. He's free as hell. It's just a matter of me getting down to it. I feel incredibly bad because I did an entire different miniseries in the interim. Right after my heart attack, Mark Miller was like, "Hey, do you want to do Hit Girl?" And I was like, "Oh, I'll write Hit Girl." And since then, crickets. Now, while there may not be a clamor for Batman Bellicosity, there are still people who talk about this cliffhanger. It's not just me. There are dozens of us. I just like things to be complete. Batman Bellicosity is an interesting case because, at least for me, I have no idea how the story would continue, let alone for 6 more issues. If you have a clear idea of where the story was headed or where you think it could be headed, please share down below. The quotes I could find didn't really give a hint as to where the actual plot of the story was going. In fact, it seemed like where it was going shifted because now the idea was that they could just go ham. But again, it felt like that was happening already in these. At this point, I would really be fascinated to see the notes on the story as it's evolved. I want to see the red folder and see what's supposed to have happened and what's changed over the years. There's also a morbid curiosity just to see the finished product and to see how people would react to it. The discourse surrounding these series has changed so much over the years, and those new perceptions of those works, of Smith, just the general comic environment, views of Batman, all of those would color the reception of Batman Bellicosity. I have never used the word bellicosity so much, and I probably never will again. It means aggressive, like someone who picks fights. Sometimes too much time can pass between projects, and even if the same creative team returns, the vibe is different, either of the work or of just the world. Or interest has dwindled past the point where it'll make much of an impact, and at that point you're basically finishing it for yourself and for the few diehards who are still around. And so the question then becomes, is it worth it for that? As it stands, sometimes I just remember that this work is not finished. I am curious, and I wish that in general it hadn't been the last big comic book appearance for Silver St. Cloud. You can still use Silver, DC. We'll just pretend that that didn't happen. It is kind of off in its own non-canon continuity wibbly wobbly place anyway, except yep, with Omniverse, I guess it happened again. That's a very time recording statement. Years from now, when the Omniverse is long just in the past, people will be like, what's the Omniverse? It'll be the same thing as what's hyper time, even though also they brought back hyper time. So I want to know, does this cliffhanger haunt anybody else? Do you want to see Batman Bellicosity, or has that ship sailed? Do you think that public perception of the series has shifted too much to warrant concluding this series? Or do you think people are being too harsh on these books? Should we go back over them in depth? And finally, what is the cliffhanger that drives you mad? It can be from anywhere. Share your thoughts down below. I think about this sometimes, so I thought this time I would share it with you. We can all ponder it together. Please do all the YouTube things. If you enjoy hearing my mad musings, I have a Ko-fi, so please consider supporting me there or on YouTube memberships where I post some extra content. No matter what you do, as always, thanks so much for taking some of your day spent discussing comics with me. I always appreciate it. And I can say that this has lit a fire under my butt to finish that playlist before it gets to a Widening Gyre-like status. Gotta get to Johnny Williams. We need to, or I need to. I'm making a commitment. Time of recording. Until then, as always, more videos coming soon, and I will see you again when I can. Bye-bye.